to Newscentre. With me, Parikshit Luthra. In a rare address, Vladimir Putin announced a partial military mobilization, putting more boots on ground in Ukraine amid reports of Russian troops losing major territory. This would translate into 3 lakh people out of Russia's vast reserve of 25 million being called up to fight Putin's war in Ukraine. That's not all. Putin also threatened nuclear retaliation against the West and warned that he was not bluffing. Putin's announcement is also raising fear of a broader conscription, leading to protests against mobilization. As per an independent protest monitoring group, over 1,400 protesters were detained across Russian cities. The Russia-Ukraine war was in the spotlight at the United Nations General Assembly meeting, while US President Joe Biden slammed Russia's nuclear threat as a reckless disregard. Ukrainian President Zelensky said, and I quote, "For us, this is the war for life."
I want to remind you that our country also has various means of destruction, and for separate components and more modern than those of NATO countries. And when the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, to protect Russia and our people, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal. This is not a bluff.
Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky,
for trying to steal our territory.
You cannot seize a nation's territory by force. Russia's calling up more soldiers to join the fight, and the Kremlin is organizing a sham referenda to try to annex parts of Ukraine, an extremely significant violation of the UN Charter. This world should see these outrageous acts for what they are.
We cannot agree to a delayed war because it will be even hotter than the war now. For us, this is a war for life.
All right, let's go across to Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, former diplomat, and also Fred Weir, a special correspondent at the Christian Science Monitor, joining us from Moscow. Ambassador Prakash, how do you see this latest address by President Putin ordering partial mobilization, calling up almost 300,000 reservists?
Parikshit, greetings. This is a very dangerous and critical stage that the conflict has gotten into. Calling up the reservists is an ominous development, something that one was hoping not to see. If one looks at it, it's the tacit admission by Putin that they have faced a huge setback at the battlefield. And you are absolutely right, it is not Russia's war, it has become Putin's war. 7 months, very little has gone right for Russia. And it is not just a huge setback for military setback, but a huge blow to the standing of Russia. Russia is a depleted power. And also what is noteworthy is that a former superpower has gotten humbled in its own backyard. So something has gone seriously wrong, whether it is a miscalculation, whether it is a faulty intelligence, whether it's good leadership. But the problem is that Putin believes that he's like a czar, and he's now a wounded tiger, an angry tiger. And how will we act in future if he's going down? I will take his threats seriously because he is capable of causing damage. He may not go down alone, but this is the time where cooler head should prevail, because you know what is happening is everybody is talking peace but waging war. Everybody's side is saying that they want to discuss it on the negotiating table, but trading insults and name calling. This is actually the time to sit back and sit down on the negotiating table and hammer out a solution, because otherwise we are heading towards a major crisis, likes of which the world has rarely seen earlier.
Right, so you're saying that Putin calling up reservists is an ominous sign, and we need to sit across the table and come up with a solution. Fred, if I can come to you, what is your sense after hearing President Putin's speech? Is the Russian president, going to escalate the offensive even further?
Definitely. I think the point of this is, first of all, to stabilize the lines that they have, to not allow Ukrainian counteroffensives, such as the one in Kharkov a couple of weeks ago, to succeed. And the Russian calculation, I think they're going past the point of no return with these referendums and so on. They're going to declare that front line now is the state border of Russia. And that's a radical new thing and suggests that there will be no backing off. And then they're going to bring up reserves, this 300,000, as I think you pointed out. Russia has potentially got 25 million, people with men of military age who have army experience. So 300,000 isn't that many, but these are people with vital military skills, combat experience, and they're clearly going to be thrown in, if not before winter, then perhaps in January, when the ground is frozen and the time for offensives is good in this part of the world. And that definitely portends much wider, much more destructive and bloodier war.
Right. So you are expecting things to get worse here on. Ambassador Prakash, when you hear President Biden at the UNGA, when we heard President Zelensky, what do you think the mood at the UNGA was, and what is the big message that comes out of there when it comes to President Putin's offensive and his ability to take up things a notch higher?
The mood in the UNGA, and for that matter across capitals, is rather somber, because this is a very serious escalation. And the West has committed huge resources to push back Russia. To be frank, it is not a Russia-Ukraine conflict so much as a conflict or a battle between Russia and the West, particularly Russia and the US. And in this, Russia is clearly on the back foot. It has been humbled. So now the problem is that the conflict, if it escalates and the unthinkable happens, then there is no end to it. It will become very difficult to dial it down. So what should be done? There is a lot of pressure. There is a lot of angry accusations, but also there is a reality. The reality is that a nuclear conflict cannot be won, should not be started. Also, the winter is coming, and Ukraine and Europe is going to face a huge energy crisis, food crisis. So it is something which the world did not want, but willy-nilly you have gotten pushed into it. And I hope and pray that it stops here, because the way it is spiraling, it can go out of control, and then it will become very, very difficult to take charge of it and dial down the tensions. I hope that wiser sense prevails on all sides.
Right. You're hoping that wiser sense prevails. But Fred, coming back to you, when it comes to this exercise of referendum that we are seeing some Russian-backed separatists call for in parts of Ukraine, what is the larger strategy? We had seen in 2014 the annexation of Crimea after such an exercise. So what could be the larger intention now? Is it to mark territory? Is it to justify a larger offensive?
I think it's both. It definitely is intended to those territories and the Russian occupation of them as irreversible. As I said, the state boundary from the Russian point of view will move right up to the front line, and presumably any territory they take beyond that will also become part of Russia. This is something like we haven't seen in a long time. Russia is completely off the reservation in terms of the currently acting world order. And Putin is talking in terms of Russian history a lot. And indeed, Russian history was a long parade of expanding the imperial borders. But this is the 21st century, and this is a new set of rules for our time. But these referendums, which are going to take place in the next few days, will pretty much make that a fact of life as far as the Russians are concerned. Putin made that clear. I think people may be freaking out a bit too much about what he said about nuclear weapons. He is not talking about using nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine or to win the war against Ukraine. He's mainly, and from the very beginning of this war, when the Russians bring up their nuclear arsenal, they're basically warning the West to stay out of direct involvement in Ukraine, that any direct clash between NATO and Russia can escalate to a nuclear war. But that's dangerous enough. It's a really, I mean, in response to that fairly minor setback in Kharkov a couple of weeks ago, yes, they lost a lot of territory, but they lost almost nothing in terms of military capabilities. They got their forces out, reestablished a front line, but the psychological impact of that in the world and in Russia itself has brought this on. And now I'm afraid we're going into a much, much more desperate situation.
Right. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, my final question to you in order to sum up this discussion. What kind of a diplomatic solution can work in a situation like this? You have a president who has taken the losses in Ukraine very, very seriously. He wants to check any sort of anti-Russia sentiment or anger against the Russian presidency because of this war as well. He's calling up reservists to further justify his offensive. In such a situation, how do you come out with a diplomatic solution?
That is the most difficult part, because he cannot put an end to the conflict empty-handed. He has something to show, because the nation has lost lots of men, material. The sanctions on Russia will not go away in a hurry. Russia has lost standing. It's a depleted power for what? So there has to be some gain, but given the fact that Russia has seen such setbacks, the West and Zelensky is not going to concede him any military honors, battle honors. So that therein lies the crunch, because the West is seeing that it's possible to beat back Russia. So for Putin, it's now a question of political survival. And hitherto he was in control, he is still in control, but calling up the reservists is going to cause a lot of tension, and things are quite shaky for him, and that makes the situation even more dangerous.
Right. It makes the situation more dangerous, and on the whole shows that we could be in for a protracted and complicated war. Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you very much, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, for joining us here on Newscentre, giving us your view on the latest messages coming from President Putin and also the mood at the UNGA. Time for a break, but when we return, we shift our focus to the telecom sector. My colleague Ashwin Kumar discusses the contours of the draft Telecom Bill with Deloitte's Peeyush, Vaish and Jaideep Ghosh of Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas. Don't go anywhere. That discussion coming up on the other side.
Now, the big story from the telecom sector, the government's draft telecom bill, which is now in the public domain for stakeholders to give their feedback, has proposed to regulate communication services offered by over-the-top platforms. That's not all. The draft bill also provides for penalty waiver to telcos on the back of payment defaults under extraordinary circumstances. Additionally, the draft policy also empowers the government to block transmission of certain messages and intercepting communication. So what does this mean for the sector? Well, to discuss this further, I am now joined by Peeyush, partner and telecom sector leader of Deloitte India, as well as Jaideep Ghosh, the CEO of Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Peeyush, if I may come to you first, your big takeaways here. I understand it's only been a few hours since it's been out in the public domain, but quickly, what is your understanding of some of the key takeaways, especially the focus that the government appears to be giving on waiver of a lot of these levies in case the company finds itself in some financial distress?
So, Ashmit, thanks. And this was obviously very much expected. I think this is a step in the right direction, because I think some of the previous acts were really probably centuries old, and it was time to really repeal some of those acts. And I think this bill is a very welcome bill. I think if you look at the bill, I think there are 3-4 things which are extremely critical and which have really brought a larger gamut of play into this whole piece. The first thing is that it really covers the entire ecosystem. So whether it's the network service providers, whether it's the infrastructure service providers, whether it's the OTT players. So, the OTT players, I think that's been a demand for a long time, that the OTT players also need to be in the ambit. And I think this bill really gets that into it. The second thing, which is extremely critical and important, and we've seen a historical trend where we had some challenges in terms of retrospective amendments. So I think this bill really puts that to bury, to say that retrospect issues will not arise, which are really detriment to the operators. And in fact, to the extent that they're actually giving a 5-year moratorium from the appointed date in case they have to do any repealment of any act, any statute, etc. Third thing, which is extremely important in the bill, is also the fact that any mergers, demergers, acquisitions that are going to happen. I think from that perspective, you only need to intimate the licensing authority, and obviously other acts like the Companies Act, etc., will fall in place. So I think overall, I think it's a very welcome move. And I think all the operators should be quite happy with it, and the entire ecosystem. And I think we'll wait for the bill to be enacted shortly.
Indeed. In fact, we reached out to the COAI. What they tell us is that they're still studying the bill and they'll get back to us with a formal comment. But while they do that, Mr. Ghosh, let me come to you now. There are a couple of interesting issues that have also emerged. Number one is that we find, firstly, very clearly specified, coded in the law, that spectrum is not the only route, that allocation of spectrum can also take place under this new regime that is being proposed. Your quick take on that? That has been a very contentious issue since 2012 2G verdict.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, thanks for having me here on your show, Ashmit. And this, bill and someday this would, in some form, will be an act, is definitely, updates all the 1885 to 1950 acts. Now, coming to the specific point that you've asked me, I think, yes, on spectrum allocation, we've seen it largely through the auction route, but this administrative mechanism has been included and defined with reasonable clarity, which is a part of the theme which I understood from this draft bill, that it strengthens the power of the central government across different elements of the telecom operations of in India. So this really gives government flexibility to administrative fashion, in an administrative fashion, allocate spectrum. The only thing I would like to mention is that there's a list in the draft act in terms of in which situation or to which all kinds of organizations can spectrum be assigned without an auction. The interesting element I saw is that some agencies, including BSNL, MTNL, are also included there. But I think this, for other organizations like space or defense, that gives a fair bit of clarity. So overall, it's okay as long as it's exercised in a cautious and careful manner over a period of time. Back to you, Ashmit.
Sure. Peeyush, if I may come to you again, you mentioned as one of the key takeaways being that the OTT players, the likes of WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, will now also be under this regulatory ambit. The question I want to ask you is, will this change be welcomed or will it be contested, because it brings with it a bag of compliances as well?
You have to understand one thing, Ashmi, that the government is very clear that there is no compromise on the national security. And if you really look at the theme of this bill, in multiple places in the draft bill, they've really spoken about national security and the interests of the people and the public. At any point of time, I think one of the things that they've also mentioned in the bill is the fact that any services provided which are in the nature of telecommunication services should be verifiable in terms of the subscriber who's actually performing those, who's actually doing those services. So I think from that perspective, I think anything that really calls for national security interest, I think that will obviously be welcomed by all the players in this market, no matter whether it's the WhatsApps or the Telegrams of the world or the telecom operators. And I think we've seen that over the past many years where the telecom operators now religiously as a practice follow all the rules of the game in terms of IDs, etc. So I think it's a question of getting that well drafted and a process, how it's going to get carried out. So I don't think there should be any concern for anybody.
Sure. We're running out of time. Mr. Jaideep Ghosh, final question to you. Again, just borrowing from some of the comments that were made by Peeyush on the question of compliances. Let's also keep in mind that as far as national security is concerned, that has again been very clearly codified as a part of this new draft, and it very clearly says that the government will have the power to either block transmission of any or a certain class of messages or to even intercept. The justification, of course, is national security, public order, sovereignty of the nation. Is that something that perhaps could be prone to challenge? The reason I ask is because companies like WhatsApp have clearly been saying that, look, our communications are encrypted on both ends. We cannot intercept them even if we want to.
See, there are a few elements, as I was hinting in the previous response to your previous. There are a few elements in which the central government has been mentioned as to have an authority, including not only what you said, also to waive off or to delay, in case of payment defaults under exceptional circumstances or the public emergency or national security. So these are subject to deliberations, and let's wait for next 4 weeks to see how does the consultation happen and how does the industry and the stakeholders respond. And I think we'll take a view there. Yes, in principle, some of these are likely to be kind of, if not contested, at least deliberated, that in which situation and can such powers be exercised by the government. National security definitely yes, but there is a mention of extraordinary circumstances in more than one place. So we have to see, how that gets interpreted. So we'll really see how the consultation process goes, Ashmit.
Indeed, Mr. Vaish, Mr. Ghosh, thank you so much for joining us with your valuable time, insight and perspective. It will be an exciting 30 days ahead for the telecom space. October 20th is the deadline for submitting one's comments and as well as submissions as far as the draft telecom bill is concerned. But that, unfortunately, is all the time that we have for. It's a wrap on this edition of the News Centre. Thanks so much for watching. News and updates continue right here.